we treat civil religion as kind of the gateway drug to Christian nationalism, or maybe it's a kinder, friendlier, softer, cuddlier version. I mean, it's not quite storming the Capitol, but it's still problematic in a democracy for a pluralistic society.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, tell you a little bit about our moving woes, and then later on in the pod, we sit down with Brian Kaylor. Brian Kaylor, along with his co-author, Beau Underwood, have a brand new book out titled Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. It is a great conversation and a pod that you're not going to want to miss. Stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
I'm doing okay.
Good.
Hanging in there.
Good.
We have really, I could say a couple of things consuming our lives.
We have
right
a couple
now.
of plates spinning in the air right now, don't we?
Yeah. So, and I think I've found a correlation that I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
So, the first thing it would be our move. We shared with listeners. We're in the middle of moving.
We are.
Second thing would be Christian nationalism.
Well, it's always spinning in the air, but yeah.
Right. They're kind of all consuming. And oddly enough, they're very related.
Okay. So please connect the dots for me and for everybody out there going, huh?
Right. Or I'm just so exhausted that nothing is making sense. So we are in the process of moving into about 100-year-old home that was, kind of in my family for the last few years. And we've decided, this will be a fun project.
I don't know if the words fun ever.
You and I have long kind of romanticized, the older home, some character, fixing it up. And this is a time in our life we don't have kids at home. We're like, we could do this. We can move into this little house. We can spruce it up. Well, it turns out 100-year-old homes need a little more than just sprucing up. Silly me. What did we know? So we're in that stage of this process right now of uncovering the warts, the bumps, and all the things. But
instead of sprucing up, maybe it needs to be propped up.
Yes, there's also that. So as it turns out, we are starting the slow process of moving, but we are not living in this new house yet.
This potential of beauty that we're going to be living in.
Pseudo-homeless. So let me put a plug in. If anybody's got, wants to offer up a vacation home or an extra bed, we could use that.
I can hear the no room in the inn signs going up right now.
But in the process of working on the house, trying to get some things done, one of the things that has been bothering me is when we walk in, there's just this musty smell, and I said, I can't tell if it's just normal old house smell. I've never lived in a house this old, if that's just normal,
right, or
if there's something, if this indicates a problem,
sure,
some mildew or some mold, must, or whatever. And so in the last 24 hours or so, we've found out that yes, there is some moisture that needs to be dealt with.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, we're in the process of waiting to get that assessed. But one of the things I told you about when we were deciding, do we go ahead and try to inhabit the house or just wait? I said, my fear is I don't want to get used to that smell if there's a problem. I don't want to become noseblind to it.
Right.
I don't. And then, I don't want to end up, that smell, it just gets in your clothes and everything.
Yeah.
And so I was so terrified that I would get used to the smell. And then today we were talking to our friend Brian Kaylor about his new book. And in the interview, we talk about kind of the illustration I use all the time about, does the fish know it's in water? Yeah. And then he makes reference to Christian nationalism, about how when you grew up, kind of as we did, he said, it's really in the air that you breathe.
Yep.
And it hit me. I'm like, we are noseblind to it.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was such an interesting correlation for me of my fear of, I don't want to get used to the literal, smell of this house, especially now that we know there's some moisture problem with it. But how can we know when we're getting used to that smell and the air that we breathe, figuratively speaking, in that faith space or in that Christian nationalism space? And so I don't know. It was just an interesting correlation to me that we've become nose blind, or we don't smell it.
Right.
It's just in the air that we breathe.
Yeah, sometimes we don't see it. We're blind to it. The aroma in the air, we just, grow used to it, and it just becomes just part of the air. We don't realize what we're breathing in. And that's what we're going to talk to Brian about today with his new book, Baptizing America, along with Beau Underwood, who's co-authored, not on the interview, but Beau's a great guy. It's one of those things that, and we talked to Brian a little bit about, it's similar to kind of white supremacy, that we don't realize, that we are beneficiaries of it, or we use language that has racial biased overtones to it or actions to it. And the same can be true about Christian nationalism. Sometimes what we think is benign is actually rooted in Christian nationalism or civil religion. That is contradictory to the faith that we actually are trying to practice. And both Brian and Beau do a great job in the book. Brian does an excellent job articulating that in our interview today.
He does. He's kind of like the plumber that we're expecting this afternoon to come and assess the damage. I'm like, Brian is like our Christian nationalism plumber. He's coming to tell us.
Well, they both are dealing with the same contents.
Right, exactly. See, there are so many construction, you guys, the next at least, I don't know, couple of months are going to be full of construction metaphors. We're basically like Jesus.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, Missy's going to be switching from her airline stories to her construction
nightmare stories. Everybody loves a good construction nightmare. And if you don't believe me, look at HGTV's ratings.
Very true. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you may be seeing us on HGTV pretty soon.
We're in divorce court, as usual. But so I think I don't know, it just made me think it would have been so nice, growing up, or to have known when we walked in that house, to have said, this is a bad smell and I don't want to get used to it. You know, when you're raised in that, you don't really have that option. But now, yes, we need folks like Brian and other partners that we talk about in the interview to sound that alarm and say, you're blind to it now, but now we need to address the problem. We need to look under the house, check out what's going on, and fix it.
Yeah. So kind of like smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, Brian is our Christian nationalism detector. He smells what's in the air and warns us about it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, as long as that battery doesn't start beeping in the middle of the night when it's going out, I'm good with it.
Nothing worse than that.
That's right.
All right. Well, that is a great analogy. Thank you for sharing that, Missy. We appreciate that. And coming up next, Missy and I sat down with Brian Kaylor, who is the editor-in-chief of Word&Way. He and Beau Underwood have a brand new book out titled Baptizing America. Stay tuned.
Theological education should not be an echo chamber. That's why seminary students in the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology experience an open-minded, warm, idealistic expression of what it means to be Baptist. The Baptist House of Studies supports each individual Baptist or Free Church student in the program. It doesn't matter if you join classes in Dallas or from elsewhere through the hybrid format. Learn more about the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. Go to smu.edu/Perkins. Click on Visit Campus to see upcoming webinars where you can learn more about all that the Baptist House and Perkins have to offer. That's smu.edu/Perkins.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Brian Kaylor is an award-winning author and journalist. He serves as president and editor-in-chief of Word&Way, a Christian media company based in Missouri since 1896. Brian is the author of 4 books on religion and politics: Vote Your Principles, Party Must Not Trump Principles, Sacramental Politics, Religious Worship as Political Action, Presidential Campaign Rhetoric in an Age of Confessional Politics, and For God's Sake, Shut Up. His latest book takes on Christian nationalism. The book, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism, is co-authored by Beau Underwood. Brian, as always, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here with y'all.
So, Brian, I find you delightful.
That's a great way to start the interview.
I love having you here. You are a three-peat guest, maybe something like that.
I'm at least back.
Yes.
So it's
yes.
good to be back.
We're going to start getting like if he gets 5, I have to get the jacket. Yeah.
The
Kind of like an SNL jacket.
Yeah. But I want to say, I so look forward to the day when we do not require your expertise. So I'm hopeful. Well, I'm not hopeful, but that would be ideal.
Yeah.
So
his book indicates that it's going to be around a while.
It's going to be a while. So I just wanted to say that. I wish we didn't have to keep having you back here to have these conversations. But
we'll stop doing Christian nationalism. I'll go write a novel or something.
There you go. We'll talk about that. That'd be a lot more fun. But this book is so interesting to me, and I want to start kind of with a baseline delineation between the mainline Protestants that you talk about versus evangelicals. In my upbringing, you were Protestant or you were Catholic, and there wasn't any sort of, in my mind, difference between evangelicals and mainline Protestants. The Catholics grew their religion by having babies. Everybody else had to go recruit new people. That was kind of the way I thought of it. So talk to us about the differences, like who this book is talking about specifically.
No, that is a good. It's an important question to make sure that we have our definitions set there, because there really are 2 major camps within the Protestant world, and for most of America, mainline Protestants were the dominant faith tradition, from the colonial era all the way up until the late 60s, early 70s. And there's a couple of ways of defining mainline Protestants. The classic definition is the 7 sisters, or the kind of 7 key denominations. And again, these were the denominations that were the American elite, and politically and religiously. So it would be American Baptist Churches USA, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church USA, United Church of Christ, and the United Methodist Church. And then in the late 60s, we start to see the rise of the evangelicals. Evangelicals had been a distant third behind even Catholics for most of America's history, but they rise to become the dominant group. We see this particularly when the Southern Baptist Convention, an evangelical tradition, becomes the largest Protestant denomination instead of the United Methodist Church, which was a mainline denomination. And what's really fascinating is, there are differences here between the ways that we read the Bible, the way that we evangelize, the way that we live out our faith in public life. And this mainline evangelical divide runs through a lot of faith traditions, right? So Southern Baptists are evangelical, American Baptists or the Northern Baptists are mainline. In the Presbyterian world, you have Presbyterian Church USA, which is the larger one, is mainline. The next one is the Presbyterian Church in America, is evangelical. It's really confusing in Lutheran world. The largest group is the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and they're actually the mainliners. And then the second one, which is actually evangelical, is the Missouri Synod. Right. And so, these terms, I think you can catch with that name that these terms are fluid and have been changing quite a bit. And so today, researchers do look beyond the 7. They really do divide all the Protestant world into, if you like Pew or PRI, they'll divide them as either historically Black Protestant, white evangelicals, or white mainline. And so they code all denominations into one of those. And so, for instance, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is now coded as a mainline church.
Okay.
And I think that shows some of the evolution that has occurred in CBF life. I think in the early 90s, they would have still had been considered evangelical just fresh out of SBC life. But I do think that's an accurate representation. Mainliners tend to be more ecumenical. They tend to partner better with others. They tend to be at least leaning more to progressive, although you'll have a lot of, center and even center-right individuals in mainline traditions, but there is this way of doing faith that is different than the evangelical tradition.
So interesting.
So you also talk about you draw a conclusion that Christian nationalism itself is kind of a separate religion, and then there's some civil religion. So would you kind of give us a foundation for those terms and how they intertwine?
Yeah, so there's two concepts there. One is, so we capitalize the N in nationalism when we write Christian nationalism at Word&Way, as well as in the book Baptizing America. And that is to make a claim that this is a different faith than Christianity, that Christian nationalism is not Christian. And so we're making a faith claim there, but we think Christian nationalism is a heresy. So just like we would capitalize any religion, Islam, Buddhism, so on, we capitalize Christian nationalism to make it something separate. The concept of civil religion is something that some listeners might be familiar with. And it's an important idea that we had to deal with because a lot of the scholarship on religion in public life works with Robert Bella's 1967 work on civil religion, which was this idea that the nation has unifying but generic religious symbolisms, right? Like under God and the Pledge of Allegiance is one of the examples that Robert Bella gives, and presidents ending speeches with "God bless America."
Yeah.
And these were just supposed to be, unifying, bringing us all together. And so some scholars will separate civil religion and Christian nationalism. Civil religion is unifying, Christian nationalism is divisive. And we actually take a little bit of a different approach on that. We say one thing is that civil religion can't work today like it might have in the 60s when Robert Bellis first starts writing about it.
Right.
When he published his first essay, 92% of Americans identify as Christian. So God language could be fairly unifying in the country. Today, that's only 68%. And you know this. You had guests talk about this. We have the rise of the nuns, the NONESs, right? And so we have a third of Americans don't identify as Christians. So civil religion is no longer unifying. But we also argued that it really was never as innocent as Bella thought it was. You still had 8% of Americans that were civically excommunicated because of their faith, and that is a problem. Today, it's even more divisive. And so we treat civil religion as kind of the gateway drug to Christian nationalism, or maybe it's a kinder, friendlier, softer, cuddlier version. I mean, it's not quite storming the Capitol, but it's still problematic in a democracy for a pluralistic society.
Okay, we really want to ask a question here in a bit about not only January 6th, but the year anniversary service that you mentioned in the book. But before we do that, let's talk about history, for example. In the meat of the book, you talk about how mainline denominations really paved the way for Christian nationalism today. So I know you got some brilliant stories in the book. Can you share an example or two of how mainline denominations, their clergy and leaders really set the tone for Christian nationalism and what it is today?
Yeah, and so this is one of the things we wanted to point out is that Christian nationalism isn't new, and it predates the rise of Trump. It predates the political rise of white evangelicals, and in fact, that most of the quote evidence that Christian nationalists point to today to say that we're supposed to be a Christian nation, someone like a Speaker Mike Johnson or a David Barton or Tony Perkins, the stuff they point to are things that mainline Protestants actually put in place. I actually think one of the significant ones, particularly since we were just talking about this idea of civil religion not actually being that innocent, is the putting under God in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yep.
And so this is one of those things. I mean, this is something that people pushing Christian nationalism today, evangelicals will point to this. See, we're a Christian nation. Right. It's in the pledge. Right. So first of all, it wasn't in the original pledge.
And it's been there since Jesus wrote it, right?
Right. In the King James
Not
English,
Jesus,
of course,
George Washington.
As Jesus spoke. The man largely usually credited with writing it was a Baptist minister, not just a Baptist minister, but a socialist Baptist minister, and that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
But I'm sure you've been called a socialist Baptist minister, Mitch. So there were actually some actual Baptist socialists back in the day, but and he left God out of it, and God stays out of it for what is now still about half of the pledge's life. But it gets put in there because of mainline Protestants. And there was this effort for several years, and we trace some of that. But it really comes down to one sermon. 1953, and this Presbyterian pastor knows that Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be in his church on Lincoln Day to listen to a sermon. And so he writes his sermon basically for President Eisenhower, right? As an audience of one is chosen, and he's making the case of why we should put God in the Pledge of Allegiance. That's the whole point of the sermon. And I mean, it works. I mean, it's crazy how successful it is. It's getting put in the congressional record. It's being aired on television and excerpts. Members of Congress are writing and requesting transcripts. I mean,
it went viral, right? 1954 style.
Yeah, right. Beau and I are honest. We're honest. We're jealous. I mean, we've never had a sermon. We're happy if people remember it the next Sunday.
Exactly.
You know how that is, Mitch. But I mean, so kudos to him. Successful sermon, right? But why I think this one is so important is when he makes the case. Again, we know this sermon is why Under God is in the Pledge of Allegiance. It was that impactful. He makes the case, and we would clearly describe someone giving a sermon like this as Christian nationalism today. And so I think that's why we think we need to be consistent in that kind of labeling, because he describes America as being founded on the 10 Commandments and the words of Jesus, and as a Christian nation. And then the part that I think is actually really significant and amazing, actually, when I actually read the sermon, was that he says the quiet part out loud. And that he says, well, obviously some people don't believe in God, so why would we put this in the pledge and expect them to say this? And he said in the sermon, philosophically speaking, an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms.
Oh my goodness.
They really are spiritual parasites. So from the beginning, the argument to put Under God in the pledge was saying that, well, if you don't believe in God, you're not really a real American. You're not a good American. And that's Christian nationalism, defining Americanism by believing in Christianity. And so that's really significant.
And not only that, but you're a parasite.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, let me ask you this as a follow-up, because one of the things that I've always contended is that when we see this language being inserted into the culture, especially in the 50s, a lot of things are happening across the country. Not only, the civil rights is ramping up, but the Cold War in itself is, at its height during that time, 50s and 60s. And I can remember hearing sermons from Billy Graham and others, talking about the godless communist, and the overtone was that we are the God-fearing Americans fighting the godless communist. Do you see any interaction that influenced some of these mainliners as well? The Cold War and civil rights?
Yeah, that's really important. It's in that sermon, for instance, on Under God. He does contrast. He makes the argument that the Pledge of Allegiance is so generic that he could even hear people in Russia saying it, right? And so that's why we needed to put God in it, because then they couldn't say it. And yeah, we have this. I mean, this Christian nationalism revival that we have in the early 1950s. I mean, this is the time where we put under God in the pledge. In God We Trust becomes the national motto. We start the national prayer breakfast. There's all these things are happening. We have different chapters, as you know, on each of these, and how mainline Protestant clergy and politicians are creating and codifying all these things. All of this is happening in that context, and there are frequent references to the atheism or the godlessness of Russia. And so we need to mark our nation as a way of kind of demanding that God will bless our nation, that God will be on our side, because see, we are a Christian nation and they're not. And I think that's a really important aspect of Christian nationalism still today, right? It's fueled, it gains power from war and conflict, and it also inspires and fuels the march to war and fighting. And so, Christian nationalism and war is this symbiotic relationship that it's almost a cyclical cycle that can get, I think, pretty dangerous.
I mean, that's almost as though socialism now is the new straw man instead of communism. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So let's bring it forward to January 6th, 2022. You write in the beginning of the book about that prayer vigil or the service on the steps of the Capitol. And when I read that, once again, was embarrassed to realize that I don't remember watching it, but had I watched it, would I have seen it? Would I have noticed it? That, our politicians and those who were there were still trying to convince Americans that God still favors us. And we think of all of these types of services and prayer vigils that happen that, again, I talk a lot about, does the fish know it's in water? Like, we don't even know what's happening. Unpack that a little bit for us. Talk to us about why that was so problematic.
Yeah, that was really eye-opening.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of books on Christian nationalism that they focus on evangelicals, and they always open with January 6, 2021, and we open with January 6, 2022. It was the 1-year anniversary, right? But I mean, it really was stunning that, like, here we had there was some important efforts, right, to try to mark this anniversary, to remember what had happened, that it wasn't just a normal tourist visit, right? As we were already in that era of trying to downplay and pretend like nothing significant had happened. And so there's an official prayer vigil organized by Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, on the steps of the Capitol. The same steps where a year before, some of the insurrectionists had marched up those steps and broken into the Capitol. Most of the violence had been on the other side of the building, but some had come in from this side as well. And then it wasn't an interfaith prayer vigil, but it was marked that it was going to be a prayer vigil. They had only one person pray, and it was a Christian minister, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. So we're talking about someone who has a reputation as a progressive, mainline individual. And he prayed that God would make us one nation under God, and talked about, speaking on behalf of all the members of Congress, half of the members of Congress behind him, the one party didn't show up for the vigil, saying that, we need your help, Lord, and speaking on their behalf as if they're all Christian, and they're not. And then they sang a couple of Christian patriotic songs that are in our hymnals, like My Country, 'Tis of Thee. And then that was it. And I mean, if we had a service on the steps of the Capitol, organized by Speaker Mike Johnson, doing a moment of silence, and then Sean Foyt getting up and leading a couple of patriotic hymns, and Paula White Cain praying that God would make us one nation under God, you all and we would all be shouting. Mitch and I would both be writing columns about this is Christian nationalism.
Absolutely. I'd have 800 words like that.
Right? That one in your sleep almost, right? I mean, and it would be justified. It would be correct. But we Christian nationalism can't just be Christians in public that we disagree with.
Right.
So we need some sort of consistency there. But actually what I think was most significant about that was it showed the blindness to the danger of Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
In that the answer that Democratic leaders seem to have and mainline Protestants seem to have to the insurrection a year before was, oh, well, that was just the wrong kind of Christian nationalism. We need a softer, cuddlier version. We need nicer prayers to baptize this nation for God with our political priorities, as opposed to seeing Christian nationalism as inherently a threat to democracy.
Yeah, I was reminded of this. I was talking to one of our dear friends, Rabbi Jack Moline, and we were talking about countering Christian nationalism and just the language that we use at times. We don't realize how much civil religion, the language of civil religion, as well as Christian nationalism has seeped into our own vernaculars, even encountering it. And Rabbi Moline pointed out that, the problem with the religious left is that sometimes they can, drift into Christian nationalism. It's just another type of Christian nationalism.
It's the softer, cuddlier kind, as Brian has eloquently pointed out.
Exactly.
I think that is important. I mean, Missy made the comment about fish not knowing it's in water.
Yeah.
I mean, the metaphor that I've used, similar kind of language, is that if you grew up in a white church in the United States, Christian nationalism is just in the air you breathe.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Not just evangelical and mainline and Catholic, right? I mean, it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's there literally. The flags in our sanctuary, it's the hymns it's the patriotic songs in our hymnals. It's there in the services around 4th of July. And it can be really easy just to think, well, this is just what faith is.
Right.
Right.
And then now we all need to do, I'm hoping in, the hindsight of January 6th, that moderate progressive Christians in, the few that are left in the evangelical world and those of us in the mainline Protestant and Catholic world can do the hard work now of like, hey, let's separate the wheat and the chaff.
Right. So I want to turn the page a little bit from this conversation into more of a conversation, a theological conversation, because as Missy mentioned a moment ago, I think one of the most important facets in the book, Baptizing America, is the conclusion that you and Beau drew, stating that Christian nationalism is not Christian. In fact, is a separate religion outside of, Christianity itself. That, a lot of times when we talk about Christian nationalism, we almost talk about it as our crazy cousin over there, doing their thing. But you putting it outside the realm of, mainline Christianity, even evangelical Christianity, I think is important. And in that analysis, especially in the chapter when you talk about theological conclusions, you talk about Christian nationalism making two grave errors: government and leaders as divine agents, and two, reducing the church as a state servant. But then, Brian, you even go further, stating that Christian nationalism contradicts the very teachings of Jesus. So can you explain and elaborate on those?
Yeah, and I think this is really important. I think it's important for us as Christians, right, to speak into this moment. And Mitch, you've been doing important work in helping launch Christians Against Christian Nationalism with our friend Amanda Tyler is the lead organizer of that. And I think that's really important work, right, is because this is a heresy done in our names.
Right.
And so then we have an extra responsibility to speak out against it, but also because it distorts the clear teachings of Jesus. I mean, to be a good Christian is not the same as being a good American. It can't be.
Right.
Jesus taught this actually very simply, that you cannot serve two masters. You just can't. You will at some point prove which one you actually serve. And what I'm fearful of is the fact that for generations we have discipled people into seeing no conflict between the way of the American empire and the way of Christianity, as if they really can be the same. And so we have this difficult work today. Paul had it easier, I guess, in some ways. When Paul's arguing against the dominant cult of empire at his day, it went by a different name. But when we're trying to argue against it, it still also claims to be Christian, right? And so then we have to get people to actually think about, what does it mean to be Jesus? Jesus tells us very clearly that the gospel is for everyone. The good news is for everyone,
Absolutely.
The entire world. America is not, specially loved or extra blessed or God's chosen nation. None of this. And so what Christian nationalism does is it makes an idol out of the nation, and it turns us against our fellow believers, our fellow Christians on the other side of the border.
Right.
We start prioritizing American people and American interests and the American military over Christians that live on the other side of the border, Christians who live where God put them and where God loves them and made them in God's own image.
Yeah.
Right? And so it really is a contradiction. It's opposed to the fundamental, basic, global nature of the gospel.
Yeah. I just thought that was so important to bring up. So thanks to you and Beau for bringing that up. That was great.
So you also talk about voices that are countering Christian nationalism, saying that they're crying out in the wilderness. So now that we've had this conversation, and Mitch and I know you are banging the gong of people, we've got to be paying attention to this. We've got to be countering it. Who are the other voices we need to be listening to?
Yeah, so I did just mention Amanda Tyler and the Baptist Joint Committee and their work in leading, along with other ecumenical partners, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We point to some others like Faithful America with Reverend Nathan Impsel leading that organization. And there's so many authors. And honestly, one of the things that's really exciting is some of the best sociological work that's being done on Christian nationalism is also by individuals who are, increasingly writing more about their own faith as well. So like an Andrew Whitehood and a Sam Perry are doing the deep dive scholarly work. But then sometimes they also kind of leave they leave their scholarly hat off the side for a moment and then come over here and will write about it from their faith perspective as well, because they're concerned both what they see as scholars and as what they see as believers. And so that's exciting. There is a lot of this work that is happening right now in helping push back against Christian nationalism. And also, one of the reasons we wrote this book, there's the historical part that's important, right? We can't address a problem effectively if we don't know how we got here.
Right.
So that was part of what we wanted to tell the story that's ignored. That, there's 100 books coming out this year on evangelicals and Christian nationalism. So let's have one looking at mainline Protestants, right? Because if we don't understand that part of the story, we might draw the wrong conclusions as to why this is a problem. But also, as we argue at the end of the book, we also think these are the churches that should be willing to do the hard work.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, these is where you have some of the good, progressive congregations that they're appalled by the violence of January 6th, and they're appalled that it was done in the name of Jesus, with all of these Christian symbols and Christian flags. And so, we could do that work in our own churches. Christian nationalism is still there, embedded in our sanctuaries, in our worship, in our denominations. And it's cathartic to yell and point at the white conservative evangelicals and say how horrible they are, and we'll continue to do that as well, right? But if we really want to start getting rid of some Christian nationalism in our country, the most productive spaces are going to be the mainline churches to take the leadership in their own spaces.
Yeah. A couple of things just to respond to what you just said, which I think is just so poignant, is that you are sounding a lot like what I hear churches and clergy and leaders talk about when they're dealing with their own white supremacy. That it's so ingrained into our culture that we don't even realize that we are beneficiaries of white supremacy and segregation, and while we may be advocating for equality and justice, we also have to admit that the only reason that we are where we are is because of our past. To me, that is what we're talking about with Christian nationalism, especially with mainline denominations, is that let's just go ahead and do some hard assessment and some needed confession to realize we are part of the problem. And when you recognize that, then guess what? To talk theologically, repentance and renewal can begin. And that is probably the best counter to Christian nationalism we have, as well as making those same admissions when we're dealing with white supremacy. So I thought you and Beau did a great job laying that out for us, Brian, in your book. The book is absolutely remarkable. It comes out when, Brian?
Comes out June 4th. You can pre-order anywhere right now. And the publisher said if you pre-order, you'll probably get it in the mail a little bit before June 4th.
Awesome. And the book is Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. So go pre-order that book right now. Well, Brian, it's always a joy to talk to you at Good Faith Weekly. But before we let you go, Missy's got one last question she wants to ask you.
I do. And I really should say, again, I do hope we get to talk to you often, just maybe about some happier things in the future. So thank you, Brian, for being with us today. As you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
Well, see, now you're challenging me that maybe I should have a more to tell. That's like on some happier note. So I'm going to tell you my more to tell is not about Christian nationalism. When I stopped writing and stopped listening to the crazy preachers that I listened to as an occupational hazard, I walk into the next room and I pick up my cello and I play some music.
I love cello.
I love the cello. It is mournful, and that's the type of music that makes me excited when we get some minor key in there. And so that's what I do. And my son is now playing the cello, and so that's a lot of fun as well.
Oh my gosh, it's my favorite instrument. I love the cello.
So glad to know that about you. Yeah. What a great fun fact.
We'll have a whole episode dedicated to cello one of these days. Speaking our NPR voices.
You and Brian can host that one together.
Well, Brian, it's a joy, my friend. It's always good to see you and talk to you. And best of luck on your new book, Baptizing America. It is brilliant. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I always enjoy talking to Brian, but it's also challenging at times.
I love Brian. Love talking to him. Not so much the content. Wish that wasn't always the...
Not a slide on Brian at all.
No. Just wish we didn't have to talk about this all the time. But yet we do. So something pinged in my mind while we were talking to Brian that I thought might be a fun little question for our outro today. He mentioned the story that kind of kicks off his historical look at Christian nationalism of the Presbyterian preacher who, preached a sermon to basically to Dwight Eisenhower, because the president is coming to his church. So what do? You preach to that audience
to the president.
of one, right? And that's how essentially we got under God in the pledge. And that really, I mean, and I've read, a couple of books. I know you've read a plethora of books talking about how that was really a flashpoint moment in our nation, and set the tone for so many things that have followed. So I was thinking, you're a preacher, right?
I am.
Let's say you're in that position today, and you find out the president's coming to your church. What are you preaching to that metaphorical audience of one?
Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. What a question. Well, if it was the first few presidents of our great union, I probably would have condemned slavery.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Yep. Oh my gosh, there are probably too many presidents where I would need to mention that they needed to stay true to their wives.
Okay, good point.
Yep. Oh my gosh, if it was Harry Truman sitting in there, I would probably have to talk about his tongue, because he was notorious for cursing up a storm.
No, hey, don't go stepping on my toes at the same time now. That's not cool.
Well, yeah.
Say it's in today's context. What today would you want to preach to the president?
Today? All right. Well, there's always. I'm having a difficult time picturing not a certain president in the pew before me, because there's so many individual things you would say to each president.
Right.
But let's just put a generic office of the president in there before me. And I think I would probably go to a text that many of my fellow pastors, preachers would go to, and that is Micah 6:8. And it's very familiar to a lot of our listeners, to our preachers. That is to encourage people to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. Thought about the Amos text about justice rolling down like a river, but I think the Micah text would be more apropos and appropriate for that type of sermon to a president, because as a president, or for the president, I want that person to know that you're not just president to the people of your party or to your base, your political base.
Or to the Christians.
That you're president to every citizen of this country. And if they are a Christian, if it's a president who practices the Christian faith, I would want them to be reminded of this text, or the Jewish faith as well, since it comes from the Hebrew text, that they need to follow those three mandates given to us as a person, because it makes us a better human being, it makes us a better community, and hopefully as the leader of the free world, it makes them a better president because of that. And they need to have all of those in mind to be the best servant leader they can to every citizen of the United States, regardless if they practice a faith or if they do not. So that was what I would go with, Missy, is Micah 6, to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God.
You know what I didn't hear in your sermon?
What's that?
Name calling.
Well, I want to refer back to that individual. So
you're just...
There could have been a couple of individuals where, John the Baptist could have been quoted there, brood of vipers.
Right.
Jesus could go to Jesus, you hypocrites. But who's to say? I'm going to go with what I said, Micah.
But I think that's a great text and a great message for any president.
Yeah.
So, good job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That wasn't a very difficult question at all. Speaking about difficult questions, love talking about, I didn't love talking to, I love talking to Brian. It's like you said at the beginning of this, it's always challenging to talk to him about it. But one of the things I really appreciated about our conversation with Brian and his book, Baptizing America, was really two things that I want to unpack a little bit. The first is this. One, the proclamation that he makes that Christian nationalism is not a part of Christianity. Mm-hmm. That was mind-blowing for me and really eye-opening, because I'd never thought about that, because I always, like in the interview, talked about seeing Christian nationalists as kind of the crazy cousin over there doing their thing, getting it wrong, always getting in trouble. But the way he breaks that down theologically, as well as just socially, is that no, Christian nationalists are not. I don't care what they say. I don't care how much they claim to be part of the Christian tradition, and really the only Christian tradition. They are not, and there's ample evidence to suggest that. And that was really astounding for me, and one of the things I really appreciate about the book and our conversation with Brian. So,
yeah, he does such a great job of stating the obvious in
Right.
just a way.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh, well,
yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that particular way
Yeah.
before. So I really appreciate that about Brian as well.
And then the mainline, the mainline theme that runs through the book, the history of mainline denominations, which, I would consider myself a mainline type of Christian. But to see the evidence before us that, yes, that civil religion, that beginning of Christian nationalism in this current formation, really has its root in those mainline denominations, as we mentioned with the president, the Presbyterian minister and the president. But even today, and like you said so eloquently in the opening, it's kind of in the air we breathe, and you just don't notice it until somebody like Brian comes along and said, "Hey, this is Christian nationalism too."
I feel like we just need like a T-shirt that just says "I am complicit." Like,
oh wow,
I mean, just. Because we are, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
If I feel like we all need to just own that in some way, your past, your history, our history, whatever has led you to a point where you need to acknowledge that, okay, yeah, I know I'm complicit in some things. I may not even know yet what those are or how, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to examine this, and I'm willing to try to do better.
Yeah, that's what Croatian theologian, Yale divinity professor Miroslav Volf talks about in some of his great work, is about all of our complicity in these movements, these dark movements within our world, that we are actually beneficiaries of those movements and have profited for those movements. And we cannot deny that. And not only have we done that we have been beneficiaries of the past, but we're still in the milieu of our existence. It's still part of who we are. And we're still acting out of some of those prejudices, as well as elitisms that we have been beneficiaries of, but we're still perpetuating that in our lives today. And Volf does a great job articulating that better than I just did. But yeah, it's all about just acknowledging that and really confessing it. And I really do mean that. I said that to Brian in the interview, is that I think not only do we need to claim it, but we need to confess it, that this is not only part of our history, it's part of who we are, and we're trying to get better.
I think that's the thing, is trying, like we've talked about before, looking through the glass dimly, we recognize that we do
Right.
our goal, and we strive to clear that up, to see better. We're trying, we're striving, and that is the ultimate goal, but at least acknowledging that, sometimes it's just still dim.
Yeah. Absolutely. So anyway, always great to have Brian on the show. His book is Baptizing America. Make certain to pre-order it. It's a great book. You're not going to want to put it down once you begin reading it. So, well, Missy, it's been a good episode.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.